as targets for novel therapeutics. Now it's not going to the network. So SARS-CoV-2, as you all are very well aware, is a newly emerged virus. And we have two more of very similar viruses which emerged earlier. One from China, another one from in the Middle East. And SARS-CoV-2 is more similar to SARS-CoV, which emerged in 2002. Maybe you can say it was in 2001, but it was very well recognized. The emergence was recognized in the year 2002. And MERS-CoV, which was around 2012. So it shares less homology with MERS-CoV rather than SARS-CoV, with which it shares a lot of homology or more homology. And this is a strain which we all know now is very continuously evolving because of very fast multiplication, and that is happening because it is infecting a lot of people around the world. And these evolving strains, as you probably are aware, they are classified by WHO as variants of concern and variants of interest. Variants of concern include your UK strain, which is alpha, then you have beta strain, which comes from South Africa, and then you have gamma and delta strains in the same line of new evolution of new strain. The delta strain has come up or emerged somewhere in October in 2020 in India itself, but rest of the strains, they have come from other countries. And among the strains of or variants of interest, we have Kappa, Lambda, and Iota. All these strains are there, which is a new kind of labeling. Earlier, it was they were being given these numbers: B1.7, B1.6, B1.3, then P1. But now a uniform kind of nomenclature is being proposed by WHO, which is now universally followed for this particular virus. And this is still it is almost, we are running into the end of the second year since this virus was for the first time reported from China, December 2019, and it is still causing a lot of infection. The data which I have shown over here is the recent today's data itself, and there are about 200 million cases we are going to reach very soon all over the world. These are the total cases. Among these, today only 85,000 cases appeared. Then total deaths until now are around 4 million. And today there were about 1,608 deaths reported due to this virus infection. And then this is the breakup, how Asia is being affected and how Europe is being affected. And this list can go on and go on because almost every country in the world is now affected, and it was actually affected long time back. When the virus just emerged, within 6 months, almost every country was affected by this particular virus. As this disease is fatal and there are no specific drugs to tackle the virus, whatever drugs we are using, they are either managing the symptoms, or you can say they are for management of, say for example, we start using blood thinners, which basically bring down the D-dimer in patient's body, and this prevents the clotting, extensive clotting, which was actually first time noticed in Italy in the postmortem reports of some of the patients, some of the people who were dying because of coronavirus. And others include your steroids, corticosteroids, which are being extensively used to manage the inflammatory response, which is being elicited in the patients who are suffering from SARS-CoV-2. So specific antivirals are still not there. Whatever antivirals we heard of, say for example, remdesivir or favipiravir, they are already known antivirals against other viruses. Say for example, remdesivir was for the first time reported for the treatment of Ebola infections, and later on it was actually tested on SARS-CoV patients in 2002 and following year until SARS-CoV-2 infections are still there in the world. And there were some promising results, and that is why this drug has been, people have tried, or scientific community or the doctors, clinicians have tried using this drug on severely ill patients uh, due to COVID-19. So there is a pressing need, and we have to go on looking for new and newer and more specific antiviral compounds to tackle the COVID-19 infection, as the slowdown in the pandemic is still not in the view. And even if it happens, there might be other emergencies of some related strains, some variants later on. So we must be prepared if anything of that sort happens in future. So looking for antiviral remains a mandate for all the people who are pharmaceutical companies, as well as people working in academia, who are working in drug discovery. So I was talking about the evolution of SARS-CoV-2. This is just to give you some idea. You all are very well aware. This picture I have just taken from one of my review papers on diagnostics on SARS-CoV, which appeared in expert reviews in molecular diagnosis. And SARS-CoV-2, we now know for sure, and we actually knew it when SARS-CoV came in a year or two, that it has emerged to cause infections in humans through civet cats, and civet cats were getting infected by the progenitor of this virus, which was what I would say is that bat is the reservoir for a number of kind of coronaviruses, and from there it keeps on spilling into the different cattle and other animal populations, and from there it is a huge chance that it evolves into a virus which can cause infection in humans. Before SARS-CoV, no such related virus was known in human beings. So though CoV was considered, the coronaviruses were considered to be a very, very mild pathogens in humans. They were like CoV 229, and there was one more OCH or something. So only few coronaviruses were not, and they were not causing any severe disease. But since ever since the SARS-CoV has emerged, coronaviruses have gained importance as very important human pathogens. Again, this is just to give some brief about what kind of symptoms do we face, though we all know now these are less common symptoms, and then there are some which are more common symptoms. This is basically for students who have joined today's workshop. So common fevers include, common symptoms include fever, shortness of breath, dry cough, fatigue, and myalgia, which is muscle pain, which is very extensively experienced by people. And we are still in the process of discovering newer clinical, what do you say, clinical uh, aspects of SARS-CoV-2, because in different kind of people, like say for example, people who are suffering with rheumatoid arthritis, SARS-CoV-2 is causing a lot of damage to those people. And I know personally some of them, they are experiencing severe pain, body pain, after the episode of COVID infection or SARS-CoV-2 infection. These are different kinds of clinical specimens that we can use for diagnosing this particular virus. So the unique situation that was posed by COVID-19, it provided us, or it provided the scientific community and the pharmaceutical companies with very less time, because there is an emergent need, or there was an emergent need to develop
Ma'am, your mic is mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Is it okay now?
Yes, sorry, I think in between it sometimes.
When did I went
10
on mute?
seconds, 10 seconds ago.
10 seconds ago. So this
Right.
slide only?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So the unique situation that was posed by COVID-19 is the lack of time. Basically, we didn't have much time to come up with novel therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics to tackle this infection. But it is actually what I would say is commendable that the vaccine has come up within a year of the emergence of a viral infection, and which is very, very unique to this particular disease, because never ever in the history that kind of less time is being taken in the development of a vaccine, because vaccine development also is a very, very lengthy process, as are the therapeutics, but less lengthier than the development of therapeutics. Diagnostics are the easiest part, because here you basically are not, you're just diagnosing the disease, and the person who is being diagnosed or where you are using your diagnostic kits is not at the risk of losing the life. But if you are doing a wrong vaccine, vaccine is not properly validated in clinical trials, or therapeutics are not properly validated, then there can be a danger of life. Now, this is a conventional drug discovery process among the students. As I can see, there are some students probably. Do we have some students, Kalyani, over here?
Yes, ma'am. We have PhD students. We even have some school kids over here. So we have a wide
Okay.
variety of our audience here.
Oh, okay, that's great. So I would like to listen from some of the participants who for the first time discovered a drug against any kind of microorganism.
Ma'am, we can create a polling for that. So
Yeah, sure.
Can you give me your question again, please?
The first drug discovery process. When did it happen? What was the drug and who did it?
Is there options are we going to give?
No, no options. Let them do
Okay,
it.
okay. Okay, okay. All right. So I just created the poll. Let's see if they answer. No responses yet.
Responses, yeah. Okay, okay, we keep giving them time. I'll come to that question again at the
Sure.
end of the talk. So I'll just proceed further. In the meantime, if they wish, they can Google it and write it down here.
Of course.
This is just to get them involved in the talk, so that, and they also gain knowledge out of it. So the drug discovery process, conventional drug discovery process, it involves first you constitute a research team, then set the objective, which disease, what kind of molecules you want to test, and which disease you want to target. Then you synthesize a library of chemicals, a huge library of chemicals. Then you validate each and every chemical here, first in vitro, if it is efficacious against that particular disease, which is the target disease. And then you go for in vivo validations in mice mostly. Sometimes mice is not an appropriate model, animal model for a particular disease, then you have to choose the animal accordingly. Then you go to formulation, stability, scale up, chronic safety in animals, all these findings. Then you file an investigational new drug with FDA. Then if FDA approves and they are happy with the results, they will give you a go ahead. You go ahead and take your molecule to the phase 1 study, where you give this molecule to healthy humans and see if it is working on them, and they are not facing any very severe kind of side effects. Then if successful, then you go to phase 2, where you take a small cohort of patients and test your molecule there. If successful, again, there can be a failure here, so you have to stop your study. And if successful, if the data makes you happy and makes the FDA happy, then you can go into phase 3 clinical trials. And here you take a larger number of cohort or larger number of patients to test your compounds. And if everything is successful, then you go for filing of new drug applications, and FDA reviews it properly, see all your data over there, and studies all your data with whatever you are giving. And then if they found it appropriate, they will grant an approval for the same to use this compound. Now that was the process, but then what is the timeline for the drug discovery process? So you start with 5,000 to 10,000 compounds library. In preclinical, you will reach, if you're lucky enough, you might come out with around 250, 50 or 100 or 200 molecules, which look promising in vitro studies. And then you further narrow it down based on animal studies. Ultimately, you probably will come up with about 5 compounds, which you can take to phase 1 trial, and slowly the number will keep on reducing. And you, if you're lucky enough, in about a total span of 10 to 15 years, you might have one FDA approved drug, for which you can get all the approvals done. But many a times the process is completely aborted at this stage, or at this stage, or at this stage, or at this stage. So many pharmaceutical companies are nowadays not going for any kind of conventional drug discovery process. They are incorporating computational drug discovery tools in the drug discovery process. One thing is to reduce the timeline, and second is to get more number of hits which can be suitable, and failure rate is being reduced when CAD is used in the drug discovery process. I hope I'm clear to all.
Yes, ma'am, they can raise hands if there will be any question. They will raise hand, and they can put up their question in chat as well.
Okay, great. So if you combine your CAD with drug repositioning or repurposing, then your process becomes much more efficient. Now, what is drug repurposing or repositioning? Here, we delineate a second medical use of an already approved compound, which is currently, maybe it is used or it is being shelved because of some of the factors which have made this compound unsuitable for use anymore. And the advantages of repositioning is that you already have all the ADME analysis done. ADME includes absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, and toxicity analysis for that compound being done. And it reduces your pharmacokinetics studies to a very, very great extent. The safety data of the drug is also already known, so that helps a lot. You already know that the molecule you are dealing with is not very toxic. It is excreted well, it is metabolized, not into an inactive compound. It is distributed well in the body fluid, tissues, wherever you want it to act, because there are some compounds for which you want that they cross the CNS barrier. For example, if there is abscess or there is any kind of viral encephalitis or meningitis, there penetration, the crossing of blood-brain barrier is required for the molecule. So all that data is already known, so it becomes easier for you to work on these molecules. These molecules are less likely to fail the clinical trials. And phase 4, post-marketing surveillance, this reduces the drug discovery timeline significantly. Not only the drug discovery timeline, it also reduces the cost, which the drug discovery process requires. This is just one example of drug repurposing. We can skip it. Now, role of CAD in drug discovery process. This is just a very simple layout. Though CAD is very, very complicated, I have just given you, for the understanding, just giving you the major steps in computer-aided drug discovery process. Here, what are the prerequisites if you want to go for any kind of CAD for a particular disease, which is your target disease, is first of all, you must know the protein that you want to target, because this is a kind of rational drug design. And here you design the molecule according to the protein or the target that you want to basically target or aim in this particular process. Say for example, just to clear it in your mind, say for example, RDRB can be a good target, that is RNA dependent RNA polymerase, which is being used by RNA viruses for their multiplication. So if you are able to inhibit this particular protein, then it might affect the viral replication in the host cells very significantly. And viruses, once the virus is not able to multiply, then of course it becomes a good compound to be used in inhibiting the virus replication or in controlling that particular infection by that particular virus. So you first must delineate or find out that what is the protein that you want to target, and this you can do through extensive literature search. Then second comes that you choose a library of ligands that you want, from where you want to select your probable leads. It can be a library of FDA approved molecules. If you're going for drug repurposing, then there are some molecules which are approved for use in other jurisdictions in world other than FDA. So you can use that library as well. You can use a combined library as well. And if you want to use natural products, say phytochemicals, you can go for it. If you want to use, some people have used molecules, drug-like molecules which are produced by Streptomyces. So Streptomyces, as you know, is historically known for production of various kinds of inhibitory molecules. A number of antibiotics, bacterial inhibiting and even fungal inhibiting antibiotics, they come from Streptomyces. So, and now we have a database available of different molecules coming from Streptomyces, so we can use it. And natural compound, different kinds of natural compounds are also available, libraries are available. So these libraries, they give you 3D structure of these ligands, which you can easily download in a format which is suitable for the docking software that you're going to use for your studies. So you download ligands and protein, and then protein must be first you delineate, and then you look for its structure. Its structure must be available. All the protein structures, whatever crystal structures of the proteins are determined, they are available at RCSB repository, which is also commonly known as protein database. And there you have to just search it simply, and you will be able to find if that protein already exists in the database. You can simply download a PDB structure and use it in your docking software. Most of the docking softwares, they're able to process a PDB structure of the protein. Then you have to do a preparation of the protein for docking, and you have to prepare a receptor, a docking pocket within a big protein, where these small molecules are going to be docked. And later on, after doing these interactions, the docking work, you proceed to scoring a pose, and then you rank a pose based on various parameters. Some of the softwares will give you the binding energy. Lower the binding energy, better is the molecule. Some softwares give you output in terms of scores. So lower the score, more minus value of the score, better is the binding. And it can be like, for example, FlexX, which is from Biosol YT, it can be around, the score can be around -20, -30 and below, which is considered, this kind of a score is considered significant. And if you're using Autodoc, which is a free software, there the result comes in kilojoules per mole. And this is the binding energy, and here again the values are in negative. Higher, more the negative value, better are the results. So that means there is the structure is, the binding energy is low. Lower the binding energy, stable is the dog dose. And if you're using something like CSAR, which we generally use, there the results come in binding affinity. It gives you nanomoles, picomoles concentration at which the drug is going to bind at that particular site which you have created in the protein. And that is how your results, whatever after the docking, whatever results you get, you can analyze them. Okay, now coming to SARS-CoV-2 structure, you all are aware about this structure, so I'm not going into the detail. If someone wants to know something, they can just ask me. The other point here which I want to emphasize is the number of proteins or different proteins which are being encoded by SARS-CoV. It has a genome of around 30,000 kilodaltons, and it codes two major ORF, which is ORF1AB, which codes for polyprotein 1AB, and another one is ORF1A, which codes for polyprotein 1A. So most of the proteins have this feature, and then rest of the genome is for mostly structural protein, and some of the ORF are still there in between, interspersed with the structural proteins which code for other non-structural proteins. So this virus has 16 known structural proteins and 4 structural proteins. Structural proteins include your spike, envelope protein, then membrane protein, and then nucleocapsid protein. All 4 of them are very, very important. So they can also be good targets, but here we are basically concentrating on proteases and why proteases are good targets for targeting your antiviral compounds. So now what happens is, since most of the genome is transcribed into a polyprotein or translated into a polyprotein, this polyprotein needs to be processed. And this processing is done by a combination of host proteases and viral proteases. Say if in the first step the proteases won't function, or you make them non-functional, or you make them bind to inhibitors, then what would happen is that they won't be able to bring about this function of processing or cleavages of the polyproteins, and all the non-structural proteins will not be synthesized. And if that happens, then viral replication would be significantly compromised. And that is why proteases are being considered as good targets. Okay, this is the same thing. Which protein do I use as target protein? This is the first question that you have to pose to yourself if you are going into drug discovery process. Then second question related to this particular presentation is that why should I consider viral proteases as good targets? There are specific answers to this question. One thing is that we already have a number of protease inhibitors which are in use for various viral infections. For example, HIV, AIDS, HIV infection, we can treat whatever retroviral, antiretroviral therapy, HART, or highly active antiretroviral therapy, HART, is being given to the patients. They are being treated with this is a component of the therapeutic regime, either of these protease inhibitors. It can either be indinavir, nelfinavir, lopinavir, ritonavir, darunavir, and tipranavir. So all these molecules are already known. So we know that inhibiting the proteases can severely compromise viral replication. So that proves that they are good targets. Similarly, for HCV, we have protease inhibitors available. For example, boceparavir, talaparvir, cimaparavir. And some of these compounds, say for example, darunavir, it was on the list of molecules which can be used for the treatment of SARS-CoV-2 also. Similarly, boceparavir. So these are already tested in clinical trials. If they are working on a particular, they are working on SARS-CoV-2 as well. And there are some clinical studies which report positive effect, the others say there is no effect. So the results are a bit ambiguous. So we are not sure. Neither is WHO nor is CDC whether actually using them is of any benefit. But we can always find out newer newer molecules, which may prove to be very beneficial in the treatment of SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 has two proteases. One is PL-Pro, which is called papain-like protease, and it basically is the NSP3, non-structural protein 3. And the other one is cysteine-like protease, and it is also known as main protease, as well as NSP5. So these two proteases are present, and both are very, very specific in their action, and both can be very good target for the development of novel therapeutics against SARS-CoV-2. Talking of NSP3, it is the largest protein among the NSPs in the SARS-CoV-2, but it contains many domains. It not only performs the function of a protease, it also performs other functions, such as formation of, it has a macro domain which is involved in the formation of replication and transcription complex, which is called RTC. This protein is also able to mimic many of the host's proteins, triggering the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines that produce severe adverse effects. The structure and activities of its microdomain and papain proteases are conserved. This is another factor which helps you in deciding that which proteins are to be taken up for the drug discovery, or which should be considered as good as a target protein. They should have, they must be conserved proteins. If they are conserved, and they should have conserved domains and conserved residues, so that actually imparts a lot of significance to these residues or domains which are present within a protein, and helps in devising docking pockets around these residues. Though we know that NSP3 is not directly involved in replication of viral genome, but targeting NSP3 is vital for the development of novel inhibitors for the reasons which we have just discussed. SARS-CoV-2 PL-Pro protease, that is papain-like protease, it shows 83% sequence homology to SARS-CoV, that is the earlier version of SARS-CoV-2. And many of the regions, many of the residues are conserved between the two. And even if you check it, if you align it, do your alignment studies with various kinds of coronaviruses, bat and other species and other human coronaviruses, still you find a very good sequence conservation. So that makes it a good target protein. Same happens with the main protease or cysteine protease. It shows low sequence similarity to host enzyme. This is another factor which you should consider while you are deciding on a target protein, that it should have less similarity to the host enzyme. Though we have papain-like proteases and cysteine-like proteases in the human host as well, but you have to look at the sequence homology. You have to look at the catalytic triad, though it will remain mostly conserved in humans and viruses, but then you look at the overall structure of the pocket, and if it is significantly different, then you must proceed and use the catalytic site, or otherwise you can use any other site, any other allosteric site in the protein. Yes, Kalyani, are you saying something?
Yes, ma'am. We are kind of running towards the end of our workshop timeline. So if you could please make it short. Thank you. Thank you.
So workflow, carry out extensive literature survey to identify target proteins and important conserved residues. Then you perform MSA of diverse genotypes to ensure conservation, obtain 3D structures from RCSB for preparing and analyzing a list of the, by preparing and analyzing the list of, for one protein, there might be multiple structures available. So you basically will have to decide on that which one is most suitable for your work. Decide on the library of small molecules you want to use and download it, adjust the ligands to physiological pH. If this is a survey which or tool you can use, if it is required. For some of the softwares, it is not required. Generally, the paid versions, they don't require it. They do it on their own. But if you're using a free tool, then you must go for it. create a suitable docking pocket, and perform the docking experiment. And we use for this purpose CSAR. So after detailed analysis, then you shortlist your leads. Identifying this is the results of the experiment that we performed with Empro. And this is not it. Then you have to go for MD simulations and see if the molecule is binding stably. This is molecular dynamic simulations, which basically study the effect of solvation, desolvation, and how stable is the binding of the molecule that you have chosen in the binding pocket. All these, and you must run for dog poses, the simulations for at least for 100 nanoseconds. 50 to 100 is minimum, and for that you require a supercomputing facility. You cannot do it using a high performance laptop or a desktop. So do that, and after doing all those things, we have shortlisted these proteins for Empro, that is main protease, which are inhibitory to, which shows, which are looking as promising molecules. And further, you can always do the validations. These are the current uses. This is the affinity range, binding affinity range, which is in nanomolar. Though it would be better if we get something in picomolars, but not always, not with all the binding pockets or all the proteins, you can get that kind of a low binding affinity. So this is just an estimated affinity, and it still remains to be validated in the experiments. It might increase because sometimes molecules bind at multiple sites in a protein, and that can actually reduce the binding affinity, or it might get increased. So we don't know until we perform the wet lab validation. This is just for your knowledge. These are the molecules which are binding into the binding pocket over here, which is created in the Empro protein. These are these 4 molecules which I have just shown to you. Okay, and here they are just simply depicted. Otherwise, you can see a lot of other, analyze a lot of other things over here. You can do recoring, fragment grouping, fragment building using this software. So that's all. Thank you all for your patient listening, and I have exceeded the time, I guess, a bit. I'm sorry for that.
Well, science can always do that. Thank you so much, Dr. Vandana Gupta ma'am, and all our participants really enjoyed the talk.